Part 4. The Return. Oh, I've trod on a lump of buffalo hump, and a beaver's tail from the bog, and I sometimes partake of venison steak, but I never before ate dog. Dog, dog, savory dog, another helping of succulent dog, savory and sweet, the beautiful meat of delicious, delicate dog. I've eaten enough of horse meat tough, and rattlesnake, steak, and frog, but all of my days I'll sing the praise of a steaming stew of dog. Dog, dog, savory dog, another helping of succulent dog, savory and sweet, the beautiful meat of delicious, delicate dog. I've taken a chaw of liver raw, and the bark of a cottonwood log. I've lived on roots and chewed old boots, but give me a roasted dog. Dog, dog, savory dog, another helping of succulent dog, savory and sweet, the beautiful meat of delicious, delicate dog. Buffalo meat is fat and sweet, washed down with water and grog, but I'd much rather sup on a fat Indian pup and another helping of dog. Dog, dog, savory dog, another helping of succulent dog, savory and sweet, the beautiful meat of delicious, delicate dog. Homeward bound up the Columbia from Fort Clatsop to the Kooskooskee, March 23rd to May 1st, 1806. The voyagers stabbed their paddles deftly into the water and pushed the canoes into the swollen current of the Columbia. The March winds roughened the surface of the river which the spring rains had brought to flood. Day by day, as the canoes slowly moved upstream, they met small parties of Indians fishing for sturgeon and seal. Sometimes the party stopped for friendly trade and barter. They camped on Deer Island and hunted. The ponds and marshes were thick with geese, swans, cranes, and canvasback ducks. At night, the frogs set up a booming chorus, and the banks swarmed with garter snakes coiled up in ringling balls. Wading in cold water to their armpits for hours, the patient squaws filled their canoes with delicious white bulbs of wappatoo roots, which they dug from the muddy bottoms with their toes. Soon the multitudes of salmon would be rushing up the river, bringing plenty to the hungry tribes along its banks. Half-starved families coming down in their canoes from upriver to seek food in the lower valley reported that above the falls, as far as the Chuppanish Nation, the Indians were starving. There was no game on the plains, and the Indians had used up their winter supplies of fish. At this news, the party decided to halt and collect meat to last until they reached the friendly Chuppanish, where they had left their horses on the trip west. While the camp hunted and jerked deer and bear meat, Clark went exploring. Hidden from view by the river islands, he found the mouth of a great river which the Indians called Multnomah. It was later called the Willamette by the white men who built the great city of Portland, Oregon, on its banks. Clark stopped to visit a tribe living in a steep-roofed house built of boards. It was over 200 feet long and divided into 7 apartments. When Clark entered one of these, by the low hole that formed the door, the Indians drew back with sullen looks. They refused to smoke or trade or even accept his offered hand. Then Captain Clark nonchalantly sat down before the fire, took a powder fuse from his pocket, broke off a piece, and tossed it into the fire. The flame flared up in a great sputtering blaze. The Indians shrank back in terror. A frightened squaw came forward, offering Clark a basket of roots. She begged him to quench the bad fire. As the blue flame died down, he made passes with his hands to show his magic powers. The Indians now brought out more baskets of roots. Clark paid for what he took, made a few presents, smoked a friendly pipe, and returned to camp. Again they loaded the canoes and paddled on under dark cliffs 1,000 feet high. Down the rugged steeps little streams fell in long feathery ribbons. They again passed Beacon Rock and came to the foaming narrows. There they unloaded the canoes and carried the heavy baggage on their backs around the portage. A cold wind lashed the rain in their faces as they clambered over the slippery rocks. Lynx-eyed Indians hung about the piles of baggage, waiting for a chance to steal. The guards with short-barreled rifles stood ready to shoot anyone they caught pilfering. In spite of this, knives and hatchets continued to disappear at an alarming rate. In the rock-strewn river below, the men brought the empty canoes one by one up the furious rush of water with a single elk-skin rope. It took 3 days to advance 7 miles. Reuben Fields had stopped and bought an especially tempting dog from 2 mean-looking Indians. When they found that he was alone, they attempted to take the dog away from him. Fields jerked out his long butcher knife and made a couple of slashes at his enemies. Terrified, they disappeared into the underbrush. Someone reported that Scannon, Lewis's dog, had been stolen by the Indians. 3 hunters went immediately in pursuit with orders to shoot if there was the slightest resistance to returning the dog. Soon they heard Scannon's protesting barks, and as the hunters came in sight, the thieves left the dog and made off. With a great barking and tag-wailing, Scannon was brought back in triumph. While the main party was pushing up the long narrows toward the falls, Clark traded among the Indian villages. With much difficulty, he procured 4 horses at exorbitant prices. With the aid of these, they portaged around the long narrows and the falls. From these thieving Indians, Clark obtained 6 more horses. Lewis furiously threatened to burn an entire village unless a stolen blanket was returned. The baggage was now transferred to the backs of the horses and the canoes traded to the Indians. These Indian horses were wild and vicious stallions. In spite of all precautions, some of them broke away each night. Precious morning hours were wasted in searching for them. The men were glad at last to leave behind them the chutes and rapids of the river and the thieving tribes that lived on its banks. The captains engaged an honest Chuppanish Indian to guide them across the broken upland plains to the mountains and the country of his friendly tribe. At the end of a hard day's march, the party halted to cook their meal of lean jerk elk meat. Suddenly a band of 7 warriors rode up. The chief explained that he was Yelit, chief of the Walla Wallas, to whom the captains had given a medal last year as they came down the Columbia. He invited the white men to his camp. There they could rest and eat. He would give them plenty of horses. It was comforting to be again among friendly Indians. At the Indian camp, the Walla Wallas provided plenty of fuel and fat dogs for the famished travelers. Yelit brought up a beautiful white horse that would delight the heart of any Kentuckian and presented it to Clark. In turn, the captain gave the chief his sword along with some powder and shot. The Indians brought them their sick for treatment. Clark applied salve to sores and eye water to sore eyes with healing effect. This resulted in more presence of dogs and horses. 100 visiting Chimnapoos came that night for a big dance. Cruzat played his gayest tunes and the men shook a limber leg. The Indians responded with their more solemn tribal dances. When the white men said goodbye to their regretful Indian friends, they had 23 fine horses. 3 Walla Walla braves rode a day's journey after them to restore a steel trap that had been left behind. Lewis wrote in his journal, "Of all the Indians whom we have met since leaving the United States, the Walla Wallas were the most hospitable, honest, and sincere." Recrossing the mountains May 1st to July 1st, 1806. Leaving the hospitable Yelit, the explorers marched across the broken plains toward the foothills of the Rockies. It was a lean land, and the Indian families they met were poor and hungry after a long winter. They found one of the Indian guides who had taken them down the Columbia. He said he would lead them to Twisted Hair, with whom they had left their horses and sandals the year before. They were anxious now to recover the horses for the journey across the Rockies before the Indians left for the Buffalo Plains. The Chumpanish lived in long shed-like houses that accommodated 10 or more families. From them, the captains were able to purchase a few dogs, but these Indians, unlike many tribes, looked on dog-eating with contempt. As the white men sat at dinner one evening, an Indian who was watching them took a lean puppy and threw it into Captain Lewis's plate, laughing loudly at the joke. The enraged captain jumped up and hurled the unhappy pup in the Indian's face. Flourishing his tomahawk over the Indian's head, he said that he would kill him if he ever dared to repeat the insult. The terrified Indian departed, and the dog-eaters finished their feast in peace. Before them rose the peaks of the Rockies, white with snow. It would be another month, the Indian said, before the snow melted from the passes. When they reached Twisted Hair's camp, they found the old chief in an angry mood. He was in the midst of a violent quarrel with Chief Cutnose. The white men patiently listened to the dispute without understanding a word. The interpreter refused to interfere, and what he said was a private quarrel and none of his business. Durer finally persuaded Twisted Hair to smoke with the 2 white chiefs. After the pipe had gone around, the old chief calmed down. He said after his return he had cared for the horses of his white brothers, but Cutnose had become jealous and so plagued him that he had allowed him to use the horses for hunting. Cutnose had so abused them that their backs were sore, but as the horses were still in the neighborhood, Twisted Hair would return them. True to his word, Twisted Hair rounded up 23 of the horses and recovered many of the saddles from the cache, where they had become somewhat damaged. The captains gave the chief 2 guns and ammunition as a reward. Clark treated several Indians for various ailments, and they soon recovered. This news spread quickly among the tribes. He was surrounded by crowds of lame, halt, and blind men, women, and children begging for treatment. The captain patiently applied what simple remedies he knew and gave out eyewash. The trusting Indians came expecting to be healed, and the treatments had marvelous results. Presents of horses and food were brought in by patients until the corpse was again well fed. As they advanced up the Kooskooskee River, visiting Indians poured in with presents of roots and dried salmon. A chief presented them with 2 horses, without asking anything in return, and said that they might take any of his horses for food, an act of liberal hospitality much greater than any we have witnessed since crossing the Rocky Mountains. The captains held a council with 7 chiefs of the Chumpanish, at which they explained their proposals for universal peace among the Indians. This idea was accepted unanimously, although the speeches had to be translated into 4 languages before they were understood. The Indians guided them to a beautiful campsite by the river in a meadow lush with grass. Here they would await the melting of the mountain snows and prepare for their trip across. For months, Private Brannan had been so weak and pain-ridden that he had not been able to stand. Someone suggested that he be given the sweat bath treatment. As all else had failed, this treatment was applied. He was stripped naked and put in a 4-foot pit that had been heated with hot fire. The patient was covered over with a roof of willow poles and blankets. Water was then poured on the sides and bottom of the hole till the steam was as hot as he could possibly stand. After about 20 minutes, he was hauled out and soused a couple of times in the ice-cold mountain stream. This operation was repeated several times when he drank strong doses of horse mint. This robust treatment so limbered up the patient that the next morning he was free from pain and very soon was as spry as ever. The same day, 3 Indians came in with an invalid chief. He had entirely lost the use of his limbs and had been completely helpless for 3 years. The amateur doctors thought the case hopeless. Why not give him the sweat cure? Someone suggested. After the first application, he was able to use his hands and arms. When he was given another treatment, he could move his toes and legs. In a few days, he was healed. Captain Clark was now a very great medicine man among the Indians. June had come. The spring was climbing out of the valleys up the mountainsides towards the White Peaks. The river had subsided after the floods from the melting snows. The men at Camp Chumpanish were restless and anxious to tackle the mountains. The Indians said, "Wait till the next full moon when the snow has melted from the passes." To limber up, the men ran races, played prisoner's base, and danced with the Indians. The party now had collected a remuda of 65 strong horses. On June 10th, the caravan started toward the mountains in high spirits. Each man had 2 horses. They camped on a high plateau, which they called Quamash Flats, and next day rode into the heavily timbered hill country, over trails tangled with fallen trees. Higher up, they came to great snowbanks 10 feet deep, covering the rocks and fallen timber, but firm enough to support the horses. As the snow became deeper, it completely obscured the trail. There was increasing danger of being bewildered in the trackless wilderness. Better go back while the horses were yet strong to where they could find game and pasturage and engage Indian guides who knew the trail. The heavy baggage, including their precious instruments and papers, was secured on high scaffolds. For the first time, the expedition reluctantly turned back on the trail. Drewer and Shannon went ahead to the plains to secure guides among the Chumpanish Indians. For several days, the main party slipped and slid down the mountainsides, the hunters searching in vain for game. At their old campsite at Quamash Flats, they met Drewer and Shannon returning, with 3 Indian guides who knew the trail. It was 160 miles across the mountains to Traveler's Rest. The procession pushed its way into the gaunt world of snowy peaks to the mountain top where they had left their baggage. It was safe and untouched on the tall poles where they had left it. Their guides led them surely across the bleak ridges and along the tops of dizzy precipices. On the hard crust, where the snow had covered the rocks and fallen trees, the horses could make good time. The silent Indian guides moved across the wild landscape with a marvelous sureness. On the top of the highest peak, the party stopped to survey the panorama of desolation while their guides smoked to the Great Spirit. When they came to a southern slope where the snow had melted, they stopped and grazed their famished horses on the lush grass for half a day. On June 29th, they left Mountain Snows and rode down to cross the main branch of the Kuskuski, climbed another high mountain, and camped that night at a spot where the hot springs gushed out from naked rock. Here everyone relaxed and took hot and cold baths to celebrate. Next day, the party made good time over an excellent trail. There was plenty of game and hunters killed 6 deer. They camped at Traveler's Rest Creek for a couple of days to rest the horses and to make their plans for the 3,000-mile journey across the plains. The 156 miles of Rocky Mountains had been crossed in 6 days. They would surely be back in St. Louis before winter. At Traveler's Rest, the explorers made a bold decision. The party would separate. Lewis would proceed almost directly east to the falls of the Missouri and then explore northward along the Marias River. If he were alive, he said, he would join the party coming down the Missouri at the mouth of the Marias on August 5th. Clark was to go southward to the head of the Jefferson River where the canoes and baggage had been cached last year. Here, Sergeant Ordway, with 9 men, was to descend the river with the canoes. Clark, with the remaining 10 men, including York and Charbonneau, and 50 horses, would cross overland from the 3 forks to the Yellowstone. They would proceed down this river by canoe to the Missouri, where if they arrived first, they would wait for Lewis. Sergeant Ordway, with 2 men, was to go by land with the horses to the Mandan villages on the Missouri. Distances and timing were carefully calculated, and everyone was coolly confident that he would be at his assigned destination on time and according to plan. After 2 years of faultless cooperation, the captains and men counted on each other for perfect teamwork as a matter of course. All our preparations being completed, we saddled our horses, and the two parties who had been so long companions now separated with an anxious hope of soon meeting, after each had accomplished the purpose of his destination.